There are nearly 20,000 murders annually in the United States.
Perhaps it's the weather, but the Pacific Northwest has become the notorious home of serial killers and bizarre crimes.
We're here to discuss those murders,
To try to understand the motives,
respect and remember the victims.
and explore the humanity of it all.
I'm Emily Rowney.
And I'm Alisha Holland.
And this is Murder in the Rain.
It was a warm summer day whose night was engulfed with a rainstorm. It was the last night that 8.5-year-old Ann Burr would spend in her bed. It was the last night her family would see her alive. Today I'm telling the story of the unsolved mystery of Ann Marie Burr, how her disappearance rocked her Tacoma neighborhood, where most experts believe her body is buried, and what best-selling author Rebecca Morris thinks happened to Ann, and how her disappearance and, most likely, murder are connected to one of the Northwest's most infamous serial killers. Beverly and Donald Byr were in their mid-30s in 1961. Married, but not necessarily happily, they were the parents to Julie, Mary, Greg, and their eldest, Ann. They were the all-American Catholic family. It was known, but not openly discussed, that Beverly wasn't exactly fulfilled by her marriage to Donald. He was controlling, and she had a creative spirit that was ready to break away from him and venture out on her own. But that would take time, as the 1960s weren't exactly a friendly place for a single mother of 4. Donald was the spanker of the children, although it wasn't frequently, but he was known to be stern. Beverly stayed at home with the children and didn't drive. That would have been too much freedom in Donald's eyes, a man that controlled his wife's hobbies and where she was spending her time outside of the home.
Ugh, I don't like that.
No. From the beginning, there were red flags in the marriage, but given Beverly's neglect in her own childhood, it wasn't surprising that she ended up with old Don. Before Beverly was born, her mother lost a son. Soon after, she tried for another boy, a replacement of sorts, but she got Beverly instead. And Beverly was never going to meet the expectations of her mother or fill the shoes of her deceased brother. Ironically, her mother also felt that Donald wasn't good enough for her not good enough daughter, that he was too blue-collar and not educated enough. But they were young and in love, and they didn't care what their families thought, so they eloped. Later, renewing their vows under Catholic rules. I don't even know how you would say that. Catholic things with Catholicism. I thought you would know. And now it was Donald's family's turn to be outraged. They were not Catholic, and they hated that he had converted for Beverly. So their marriage was off to a great start. Eventually, they had their first child, Ann Marie Burr. Born December 14th, 1952, she was a sweet girl, known for being well-behaved, listening to her parents, sleeping well. She was also very much her mother's daughter. Of all the children, Ann was most like Beverly. She, too, was talented, stubborn, and loved by all who knew her. She was cute as a bug, too. She rocked a chin-length bob with bangs that suited her smile, a smile that was showing off where her 2 front adult teeth were halfway grown out. Some saw Ann as the favorite of the family, that she always got what she wanted, while others saw her as a very intelligent little girl, but she had tantrums. Her uncle considered her brilliant. She had a sweet, almost flirtatious, outgoing teddy bear of a personality, and she took her duties as the oldest sibling very seriously. The summer of '61 in Tacoma, Washington, was not remarkable in any way. The children played with neighborhood friends, riding their bikes and playing in yards, most often in the Burr yard, as the household was known for being the kid house. The door was always open to anyone in the neighborhood at 3009 North 14th Street. Just 38 miles southwest from Seattle, in what nowadays would be a 4-hour drive. Seattle traffic humor.
Yeah, it's true.
Tacoma was home to a population of 147,000 in 1961, as opposed to the 213,000 of today. While Ann's neighborhood in '61 was a pleasant suburbia, it also held an ominous nickname, the kidnap capital of the West. But we're not going to get into those stories right now. We'll do a separate, more detailed episode on that later. But yes, through the first half of the 20th century, multiple children had been kidnapped from Tacoma. But that name didn't deter the children from playing with friends, and they had many. Susie, Ted, and Christine were neighbors and friends of Ann. One of her closest friends was 15-year-old Robert. Robert and Ann had an interesting relationship that I would think would make many parents' skin crawl nowadays. At 7 years her senior, Robert referred to Ann as his girl, while she called him lover boy.
Oy vey. Yeah, that wouldn't be happening in my household.
And yeah, not so much. And I really wish that I wasn't as cynical as I am, and I could see that he was just maybe being a sweet
older
teenage
brother.
boy. Yeah, and,
Ugh.
being nice to the neighborhood girl that was playful, but I'm
I
jaded.
just can't see that happening.
I mean, yeah, could you imagine Chloe playing with like a 17 or 18-year-old?
Well, just yesterday or Friday, she was at a friend's house, and her older brother was having a birthday party, and that even was like, do I let her go?
Yeah.
Like, oh.
Let alone lover boy. It was the 60s. They spoke differently. It was 8:30 p.m. on Wednesday, August 30th, 1961. Anne was home after having dinner at a friend's house, and all of the Burr children were now in bed. Anne and her sister Julie, just 14 months younger than Anne, normally shared a bedroom, but that night Julie slept in the basement with Greg and Mary. After being awoken by her sister Mary, who sought help, Anne escorted her to her parents' bedroom. See, Mary had broken her arm a few weeks earlier, and the cast was causing her uncomfortable itching. Once Mary seemed settled, Anne found her way back to bed. At 11 p.m., the family dog Barney woke the Burr parents as his barking at the storm became nearly unbearable. #Henry.
Come on, give him a break. He's a puppy.
Unbearable, but they didn't go check on the dog. It was 5:15 a.m. when a neighbor of the Burrs was awoken by frantic knocking on her front door. It was Beverly. She was in a tizzy as she couldn't find Anne. The family had searched the house, but there was no sign of her. There were, however, signs of foul play. The front door, which had been closed and locked when the parents went to bed, was now open and ajar a few inches. A window that, due to the antenna placement in the house, was always open a little, was open much further than it should have been. The final piece that really alarmed the family was that their small garden bench wasn't where it belonged. It was supposed to be at the back of the house, and instead it had been dragged and placed under the window that had been opened. On it was a shoe print made by mud, a lucky remnant from the stormy night. That muddy shoe print was far too large to have been Anne's. The neighbor that Beverly reached out to was on her way to work and couldn't continue helping. Her son, however, 15-year-old Robert, or as he was known to Anne, Loverboy, was home. He stated that he hadn't seen her, nor had his sister, who also played with Anne from time to time. Beverly moved on to the next neighbor, then the next, and the next. At 5:30 a.m., the first call to police was made. An officer for 3 years, Roland Otis, was the first on the scene. The initial report stated that 8-year-old Anne had, quote, taken off in her night clothes. The officers started with a search of the Burr house. Once they took in the scene, including the door, window, and bench, they called for backup. It didn't take long for them to realize that this wasn't just a case of a young girl wandering out of her home, which Anne had never done before, nor was it in her character to do so. In addition, she was wearing a bracelet with her address on it, and she knew how to find her way home. Police followed Beverly's lead and started asking neighbors if they had seen her. They even did searches of nearly every home in the neighborhood. Only one neighbor, an older widow, refused. As they didn't have warrants, there was nothing they could do but move on to the next house. Patrols scoured the neighborhood and community for any sight of Anne. That first morning, Don and his brother went searching, calling out for Anne, talking to any passersby they could, which weren't very many as it was such an early hour. They made their way to the playgrounds and parks before eventually ending up at the construction site surrounding the University of Puget Sound campus. There, across the way, they saw a young man, perhaps a teenager, standing over a pit of open earth as part of the construction. Watching closer, they realized he was stamping the dirt down, compacting it with his foot. Being that it was too early in the morning for construction crews to be working, the boy stood out, but they didn't pursue it any further other than mentioning it in their reports.
That is shocking.
It sounds like it was just far enough away that you could see it, but not.
That's just the way my mind works.
Right.
I would wait for him to leave, and then I'd absolutely go look at what was under there.
Right. You'd think so. Investigating officers continued to search homes, ravines, fields, and roads. The most information they got from neighbors was a claim that there had been a peeping Tom running around the neighborhood. No one knew who the culprit was, but they felt strongly the two were connected. Eventually, a team went to Anne's grandmother's house. She lived nearby, and Anne loved going to her home, So with all the hope they could muster, they knocked on her door and asked if Ann had come to see her. They did not get the news they had hoped for. As word continued to spread about the disappearance of a little girl, more and more gathered to aid in the search. The National Guard joined in, as did hundreds of citizen volunteers. A focal point of the search was around Point Defiance Park, as
Dun,
in
dun, dun.
episode 23, Point Defiance, as that was where one of the last photos of Ann had been taken. Eventually, a helicopter came to provide an aerial view of the area and hoped to find any sign of Ann or a disturbed plot of land. In addition, a vigilante squad joined the groups. They had been formed in the 1940s as a way to help manage the fraud and corruption of the local government. When they saw just how much work needed to be done in their community and how their expertise could help, they branched out into missing children and other unsolved crimes. But this wasn't the 1940s, and they were limited now on just how much help they could provide. As the search continued through the weeks and was continually broadened, the city's sewer network was searched, scuba divers would go to Commencement Bay when the tide was low to look for her body, ponds were drained, surrounding cities and construction sites were searched, the ditches at the University of Puget Sound were searched as well, but by the fourth day of Ann's disappearance, when officers finally made it back to the campus, the area had no ditches that were still full of water, and the section where the teenager had been spotted stomping the dirt had already been paved over.
Ouch.
Back at the Burr home, the police started interviewing members of the family. Mom and Dad gave the same account. Ann brought little Mary into their room because of her itchy cast. Ann went back to bed. Barney barked at the weather, or so they thought, now realizing he may have been barking to warn them of an intruder, and they woke up to find Ann missing. That being the case, it meant that Mary was one of the last people to see Ann, but she was a mere 3 years old, so try as they might, they just couldn't get any concrete answers. While questioning Julie, she mentioned that the day before Ann's disappearance, she had spoken to a stranger. She told police that this person was dressed strangely in women's clothes and a veil, but was clearly a man. He asked her what house they lived in before he drove away.
Oh, that's terrifying.
Mm-hmm. She was racked with guilt over not having told someone about the stranger. Perhaps he was the one to blame for taking Ann, and if she had just told someone, things would have turned out differently. Back at the house, the police were using Ann's doll to get her fingerprints. They documented the shoe print on the bench, a red thread caught in the window, a shoe print in the flower bed by the basement door, and blades of grass on the living room floor. As all the evidence was being processed, police were careful not to get too excited. This was, after all, the home of 6 people, mostly children, including a dog and the neighborhood kids. So what some may have looked at as evidence could have merely been proof of a busy home. One of the larger gaffes in this case was the home not being closed off as a crime scene to friends and family. Hello, Jean Benet. So when police left and came back to do more fingerprinting and other detailed processing, a family friend, just trying to help, had spent the afternoon cleaning the home. So any fingerprints or additional evidence had been wiped away.
This is why we just don't clean.
I keep a filthy home just in case of a crime. You never know. You got it all, baby. Before the cleaning, police had noticed something important about the home. There was no sign of a struggle. Nothing had been knocked over or was out of place. Even the decorative figurines under the window that had been opened were unscathed. Had the intruder known the home, the dog, and perhaps even Ann? Did she hear a noise or get up to get a drink and recognize a friend standing in her living room? Perhaps she heard the dog and found a familiar face attempting to climb in her window, so she opened the door for them. On the other end of the spectrum, was there a burglar that she stumbled upon and, in fear of getting caught, he took her? Was this an angry family member, a killer, a kidnapper, a person that just wanted a child of their own? The possibilities were nearly endless, leaving police overwhelmed with directions this case could go. Eventually, a police officer did a practice run to show how easy it was to break into the home and not fumble over any of the fragile figurines under the window. It was now day 2 of Ann's disappearance. Police were compiling lists of sex perverts, child molesters, exhibitionists, sex oddballs, and weirdos that were in the area.
Tell me that's a quote.
It is.
Amazing.
Well, yeah, that's how I talk. Sex perverts. Along with their own list, the tips were starting to come in. Every odd smell or questionable pile of dirt was looked into. During these follow-ups, police found a dead cat, a dead cow, and dirt. Another tip was promising, but led nowhere. A neighbor reported that 2 hours before Ann was found to be missing, they saw a man looking into the window. This was only helpful in that it potentially narrowed down the timeline, but it didn't aid in suspects. This was also disappointing in the way that if there was a perpetrator, they had a 2-hour lead on the police's arrival. Police were hopeful, though. Now, in the second day, they expected to receive a call inquiring about a ransom. This was the kidnapping capital of the West, after all, so they set up a recorder on the Burr's family phone line in hopes of getting information that would lead to Ann's return. Tips not only came in about smells and dirt, but about people as well, like women reporting their husbands for suspicious behavior, that they would be working in their attic or garage and had been acting strange since Ann went away. Turned out they were just being men that didn't communicate well with their wives. Young men that were out of work and living with their parents were suddenly being asked for their alibis. Someone used a divining rod and it directed them towards Ann's whereabouts. Someone using a Ouija board stated that Ann was alive and well and in Point Defiance Park. Pardon my offensive and outdated language here, but there was even a report that there was a midget with a beard that was a peeping Tom. One tip that really excited the investigators was a call about a group of 2 men, a woman, and a small child that matched Ann's description. They were at a hotel in Portland, Oregon. Portland police were sent to the hotel right away. Tacoma police waited with bated breath to hear if she was found. Within a few hours, they were no closer. Portland officers could not find any group of men with a woman and child or anyone coming close to the description having checked in to hotels in the area. Desperate for anything resembling a lead, police would question any man that came by the house. They were worried the perpetrator would come by in the guise of helping, but was actually revisiting their own crime scene. At one point, a phone call was placed to the Burr home. A young-sounding female voice said, "This is Ann Marie," before hanging up. Dawn was certain she said her full name, while the attending officers disagreed. To clear up their disagreement, they referred to the tape of the recorders that were not working at the time.
Oh.
The caller contacted the home again, but the officers were nearly certain it wasn't Ann, as she never used her middle name, and it must have just been a cruel, deceptive prank. The suspect list was never ending, as there were no leads to start with. So, with their list of sex freaks and questionable neighbors, the police started with Mr. D, the local nudist.
Classic Mr. D.
Uh-huh. He was classy about it, though, and he only did it in the comfort of his own yard. But it was a well-known fact that he was a fan of not wearing clothes. The kids in the neighborhood knew Mr. D. He would pick his plums, like actual plums from a plum tree, and give them to the kids. And he would also give them candy. He was known to have been affectionate with the kids.
Ooh, in the nude?
No, he would only be nude in his own private yard, like his backyard, like covered. He wasn't just gallivanting. So he was affectionate with the kids, but it wasn't malicious to anyone that saw it. But on paper, it does not sound good. Nor is it the most appropriate. He was known to kiss their hands, put his arms around them, and for some, he would even pat their buttocks.
Yikes.
It was reported that when one of his neighbors was pregnant, he would come by daily and give her a rose, making comments like, "I like to see women pregnant, and I think pregnant women are beautiful."
Well, we need more people like that.
It's sweet, but again, when you put it in the lens of
altogether,
someone's
not so great.
A child's missing and your behavior is a little bit off, you're going to be looked at a little bit more closely. But there was no evidence connecting him to Ann or her disappearance. Being that Ann was so friendly with the neighborhood kids, polygraphs were given to multiple boys that she played with, including Terry, a young man that went to the same church and had been in trouble for window peeping. He raised suspicions by asking a lot of questions about the case, but nothing came from his or any of the other kids' polygraphs or interviews. Then investigators moved on to Ann's piano teacher, Mr. A. Every week, Ann had her piano lessons at 3:30 p.m. She would walk the 4 blocks to his house on her own, and although she never complained about his teaching, some interesting information came to light when they went to speak with him. As he showed the police his basement where he held his lessons, he mentioned that he had disciplined her a few times. That was a bit of a red flag for the police. Not the discipline necessarily, it was the 60s, but it was curious it had even taken place. Ann was a well-behaved child and loved going to piano, so the need to discipline was what was alarming. But as with all the other potential suspects, nothing came from the investigation. The inquiry leaned heavily on the one piece of evidence that seemed promising, the shoe print on the bench. Investigators searched for a men's shoe to match the print. They went to the only shoe store in town that sold the specific style. This led to a 9-year-old being questioned, an 18-year-old who had also bought the same style but was out of state for school, and then there was lover boy Robert, who happened to own the same type of shoe.
No.
Yes. So the focus was now on Robert, the 15-year-old neighbor boy with the questionable relationship with Ann. No matter how much they dug, the police could not find any supporting evidence that he had anything to do with her going missing. Sure, there was the shoe connection, but this wasn't exactly a rare-styled shoe and certainly wasn't enough to go on for pressing charges. Although his relationship with Ann was off-putting, there was no sign of him having ever been inappropriate with her or any of the other neighbor girls or female family members. There were plenty of red flags, though. Robert didn't really have any friends his own age. He would play with the groups of young kids that would run in his yard and ride bikes in his street. Robert was willing to work with the police to help them as much as he could. When taken to be interviewed, he explained that he liked Ann and playing with the kids. But one of his biggest reasons for hanging out with such little kids is that there were simply not boys his age in the neighborhood. Then they gave Robert a polygraph, which he failed. Police then treated him, without parents or lawyer present, very poorly. They started to blame him, and I would assume go full law and order and threaten him with jail time and demand he tell them where Ann was. Eventually, his father and brother came in as well, and they also took polygraphs. During that time, Beverly Burr took advantage of an empty home and went in the back door of Robert's. She searched every inch of that house, looking and hoping for any shred of evidence that her daughter had been there or was there. Jewelry, clothing, shoes, anything. But she found nothing, as did the police. And a failed polygraph just wasn't enough to press charges. So while they kept an eye on Robert, there wasn't much more they could do. I know, I feel like that's the most mom thing. Like, the whole family's down at the police station? Okay.
I mean, if you're not seeing anything coming of it, I would do the same.
And again, this is within the first couple days, so you're not exactly thinking straight or sleeping or functioning. While the questioning of potential suspects continued, the Burrs tried to shield their children from the storms of questions and fear. They were sent to a friend's house for the day when police were at the house. That same day, Don's siblings came to help, and upon arrival, they were also questioned by authorities. Moving away from the who did it to trying to find the why in hopes it would help them lead to Ann, police examined Ann's father. He worked at an apartment building. One of his duties was to collect rent. Another was to evict families. Perhaps there had been a disgruntled former tenant that was out for revenge on his landlord and sought out his child. While there weren't clear answers, and they still didn't have Ann, the police were giving all they could to this case. Within the first 12 days, over 1,500 people were questioned, and 20,000 posters with Ann's beautiful cherub-like face were hung all over the city and state. Those 1,500 people were anyone and everyone that had come in contact with Ann, from teachers and doctors to dentists and priests. The family priest, the aptly named Father Godley, was asked to take a polygraph. He was slighted by the insinuation. When pressed, he stated it would ruin his reputation if he took one, that his church would look at him as a suspect. It was obvious that, as a priest, there was no way he would or could have done anything to Ann, so they left it at that. The police were permitted to do a search of the church, which turned up nothing. Questioned further, the father was asked about a known child molester that attended his church, but they got no additional information.
Boy, this neighborhood.
Tacoma, baby. Then there was a bizarre turn in the case. The Burrs didn't have much money. Beverly's father did, but it hadn't trickled down to the children, and it was complicated. They were a middle-class family of 6 with one income. With the idea of kidnapping being at the forefront of most people's minds, it just didn't make sense why someone would take a child from them in hopes of getting a ransom. And seeing how they didn't get a call right away, as was the case for almost all the other kidnappings, the idea started to fade. Then it was pieced together that perhaps this was a kidnapping, but maybe it was just from the wrong Burr household. You see, there was another Donald Byr in the Tacoma area, and he was a very successful and therefore wealthy architect. Not only did he share a name, but he also had a 9-year-old daughter. Police went to him and discussed the possibility that perhaps there was someone in his life that had ordered for his daughter to be kidnapped. Maybe using a phone book, the kidnappers went to the wrong Donald Burr's house and took the wrong little girl. Architect Donald Byr went into detail about his estranged ex-wife who had abandoned her family when their daughter was just a few weeks old. This perked the ears of the officers, but after learning that she had left the family, left the country, never fought for custody, and didn't really have any contact with her child, it wouldn't have made sense for her to go from zero interest to kidnapping. From the beginning, the local papers were reporting on what would become the biggest news story in the state of Washington for 1961. In another record, Ann's was the largest manhunt in Tacoma history. While keeping her name and face in the public eye was important, not all reports were beneficial. One paper stated that Ann was a possible victim of amnesia. Another published the home address, which brought drive-bys and tourists for years to come.
Ugh.
In what would be repeated in so many cases after them, coming to mind first being again JonBenet, rumors and suspicions started to swirl around the family. Maybe the parents had gone out for the night, leaving the children at home, hence her disappearance, and the parents deserving of such punishment. Questions and doubts surrounding the Burrs grew more and more speculative of their innocence. Why wasn't there more evidence? Was it because the kidnapper was inside the house all along? Adding to the doubt was that the police at one point stated that her case was not a kidnapping, to which the FBI doubled down to say there was no evidence someone had entered the house
What?
and probably wandered away. So because there was no...
They're just disregarding the footprint.
Oh, well, if maybe
doors.
she opened the window to get air and walked out the door and didn't close it all the way in the middle of the night, which she never did. So yes, they were dismissing all of the evidence.
Even if she did, does that matter?
Right. Yeah, she's still
She's
missing.
A young child.
Yeah. At first, the reward for Ann's return was $1,000, which in today's money would have been around $8,600. It didn't take long for heartstrings to be pulled and donations to come in, building the reward pot to $5,000 or $43,150 $2020. With the passing of time, the anger and unassuredness of the parents' involvement led to rumors, so Don and Bev both requested to have the police give them polygraph tests to put them to rest. One of many heartbreaking interactions for Bev, she had actually gone out to local businesses with one of the donation pots. She would give her plea, asking for donations to help the return of the lost little girl, not explaining who she was. One store owner refused to donate, claiming he knew it was the parents, so there was no point. She somehow, in a move far more gracious than I could ever imagine, walked away. She didn't break out into tears or scream at him, a true testament to Beverly's strength. She knew now, with Ann gone, that leaving Don would never happen. She would have to keep the family together and raise the rest of her children. While in the midst of the investigation, the Truman Capote book, In Cold Blood, the telling of an entire family being murdered, would come to her mind. She struggled with the relief/guilt that her whole family hadn't been taken or murdered, but she couldn't help but wonder if Ann had been the target all along, or if someone had come seeking out another member of the family, but Ann presented a crime of opportunity. Years later, Bev admitted that her resilience and hope were not always so strong. Perhaps it was her motherly intuition or just being realistic, but she says that she knew that first morning, as soon as she saw the window open, that, quote, I knew I would never see her again and we would never get any answers. She also felt that probably the worst has happened. Bev carried an insurmountable burden of guilt with her through her life. Why hadn't she let Ann stay at that friend's house, the one she had had dinner with, when Ann called to ask if she could? Why hadn't the police set up more roadblocks right away? Tacoma had so many ways in and out and so much water surrounding the area. Why didn't she push harder for that? But she powered through. She would do any and every interview the papers or news would ask for. She pushed for Ann's name to remain in the forefront of everyone's minds. Hopefully to find her, but at the very least, to never forget her. At the 1-year anniversary, Bev made sure the papers knew the date and ran as many pieces as they possibly could about her daughter, asking everyone to keep a lookout for girls that looked like Ann, for farmers and landowners to check their properties again and again, for everyone to know this was something that the family was still struggling to live with every single day. How poignant it was that Anne's baby book was actually made for the first 7 years, but Bev had squeezed in her 8th and final. The family prayers changed from ending with Amen to and bless our Anne, because perhaps in some twisted way it had been God's will for Anne to be taken. The torment of a missing daughter wasn't the only pain the Burr family would experience. Don and his family's secrets were dissected by police and the media. His contentious relationship with his father and strained one with his mother over Catholicism, along with it being known that he was the stern, controlling member of his household, didn't exactly paint a good light on him. Even Beverly's ex-boyfriend was talked about and to. Even after the first year, tips continued to pour in. One woman claimed to have seen a young couple with a little girl who approached her and asked if she could leave with her, asking to go home with mommy and daddy. But, as so many before, this tip led nowhere. Throughout the years, the tips didn't get any less strange or more helpful. There was a man named Alfred who took a bus from Seattle to Tacoma to go to the Burr house. At 79 years old, he had had a vision of the house that Anne was being held at, and conveniently the Lord had provided him with an address. He told the police, but when they arrived at the provided address, they didn't find a house. They found the construction site of what would become a Piggly Wiggly. Don got a call from an ex-con/ex-POW who claimed to have intel that Anne was out of the state, and for just a few $100s, he would go out of state and retrieve her. He was also a Nigerian prince. Psychics would drive around the city with police. They would have visions of types of cars or specifically colored houses, some thinking she was alive but out of the city. One caller demanded $5,000 be brought to a park the following night. When Bev pressed for details, it was clear they had no idea what they were talking about. On one Christmas Eve, a call came in stating that someone at a seminary had taken Anne. Upon investigation, it turned out the caller was a recently fired and presently disgruntled employee that was throwing his former boss under the bus. That one bugs me worse than any of them. Like, I'm mad that I got fired. It's malicious. I know it's not true.
I think fake tips should be
criminalized.
Yep.
Absolutely. But it's also like just the idea of not only am I going to torment this family on Christmas Eve, I'm going to torment them, but I'm also going to make my boss suffer because I got fired. Another man that was in the neighborhood selling bomb shelters claimed to have seen Anne. He was a bit of a strange dude, as I can imagine a door-to-door bomb shelter salesman would be, but he was cleared and passed a polygraph. Unfortunately for everyone involved, nothing came from any of these tips. Decades later, be it out of a sort of confession or perhaps the only sense of closure the public could make of it, a name was connected to Anne's disappearance. It was one of the neighbors she had known but hadn't been super close friends with. He was 14 at the time of her disappearance. His name was Ted, but you probably know him better as Theodore Ted Bundy, one of history's most prolific and notorious serial killers. We all know how Ted Bundy's story ended, but Anne's disappearance may very well be how his story of being a monster began. In 1946, Ted's mother was unmarried and pregnant. She was sent from Philly to Vermont for a home for friendless women, as the father was not in the picture. Ann Rule, famous author and friend of Ted's, never believed the story of the father, but that perhaps Ted had been a product of incest or an affair with a married man. Once his mother gave birth to him, she left the home and him in it. She was the first woman in his life, and she abandoned him. It took 3 months of his grandfather pressuring her, but eventually she went back for Ted and brought him home. By the time Ted was 5, he had been given 3 different names. Growing up with his grandfather as one of his only male role models was far from ideal. His grandfather was abusive towards his own wife, his daughter, Ted's mom, and animals. Not only was he outwardly violent, he had pornography depicting it as well. Pornography that was easily accessible to a young, curious boy who was undoubtedly overwhelmed by the sexualization of BDSM. Words used to describe Ted's grandfather were such charmers as tyrant and racist. As Ted got older, his own history became confusing and unknown. His grandparents claimed to have adopted him to cover that he was illegitimate. As Ted grew up, he would tell stories about thinking his grandparents were actually his parents and didn't find out until he was older that his sister was really his mom. Other times he would say he knew all along his mom was his mom. Yes, he was a pathological liar, but it's also possible he really didn't know. And for the record, if we could just erase the term illegitimate, I hate it. I hate that your legitimacy as a person matters because your parents signed a piece of paper or something like. So that's my platform. Thanks. In 1961, Ted Bundy was starting his 9th grade year, but going back to as early as 3 years old, and Ted's tendencies were already starting to show where his future would lead. At that young, innocent age, Ted once surrounded his sleeping aunt with knives from the kitchen. Imagine how she felt upon waking to find this baby watching her as she took in the disturbing scene around her. Joining the local church group, Ted's mother met a Southern man that had been in the military. Within a few months, they were married, and eventually they made their way to the north end of Tacoma, Washington. While Ted took his new stepdad's last name of Bundy, they never really developed a deep bond. That lack of bond only widened when new siblings came into the picture. 2 daughters, 2 sons. Siblings that weren't born in a bastard home, that were fully related and knew who their dad was. Children that were now getting all the attention from his mother. Ted hated Tacoma, but enjoyed riding his bike everywhere. One place he hated/loved going was his cousins. They also lived in Tacoma, and they were a well-to-do family with a nice house and nice cars. While he was good friends with his cousin, there was always a twinge of jealousy of their having the amenities he felt he deserved. As he approached his teen years, his depraved behaviors increased in severity and frequency. Ted was known by all the neighborhood kids for luring young girls into the woods. Once there, he would pants them and urinate on them in what was believed to be a show of dominance and humiliation. He was also known for dousing cats with gasoline and lighting them on fire, or he would use a knife to gut them. He would cruise the neighborhood with his friend Doug and slash the interiors of parked cars. Because of these first-hand accounts and rumors, most of the kids kept their distance from Ted.
I would imagine so.
This led to him struggling with loneliness and feeling empathy. There were even instances when he was found digging in the trash looking for porn, and while he had a few friends at school, no one would go to his house to hang out. He didn't help his own case for needing friends when he would, as a teenager, tantrum to get his mom's attention. He suffered from a speech impediment and was voted shyest in middle school. Not exactly the confident maniac that's pictured when you think of him in court. Then, the potential of something pivotal in Ted's development. During the summer, the kids would sleep in a tent in the yard. From time to time, Ted would hang out in that tent. The friend, whose house the tent was located, Sandy, was certain that her father, C. Holt, had molested Ted. He had been in the military and he was a Boy Scout leader. During one of the Boy Scout outings, some of the scouts stumbled upon a jarring scene. Ted and C. Holt in a tent, undressed, in the middle of the day. While the excuse of having gone swimming seemed to quell some of the boys' concerns, Holt's son Doug was not buying it. Ted and Holt's relationship was uncomfortable, and the other boys would tease Ted about it. It wasn't just the tent that made Sandy and Doug certain their father had molested Ted, but the fact that their father had molested them throughout their childhood that made it obvious to them that he had chosen Ted as his next victim. At one point, Ted attempted to pull Sandy into the woods, but her brother Doug hit him to put him to a stop. Ted's behaviors continued to develop in a way different than most kids his age. He developed a shoplifting habit, created fake tickets for the local ski lift, would talk to friends about going into houses to look for cash lying around. He also started getting into true crime. You know how those people are. As the years went on, he continued to struggle with social interactions. He couldn't understand friendships or attractions. He didn't really care about school or making or reaching goals. It was in high school that he realized just how different he was from everyone. So he began drinking. Then, Ann's disappearance. He would have been questioned had he lived closer to Ann's home, but he was right outside their immediate suspect range. But there was an array of circumstantial evidence that, without the fact that he ended up being a deranged serial killer, still show that he may have been involved. His shoe would have been close to, if not the same size as the print left on the bench. He was a neighborhood paperboy. He knew Ann. He was known for hurting animals. He was taking girls into the woods. The dots weren't connected by investigations or evidence. Rather, it was Ted's own vague confession that led to the idea of him having been involved. Once Ted Bundy became known as Ted Bundy, he was, of course, interviewed by every kind of psychological expert that could get time with him. At one point, he told a doctor that something had happened in the summer of '61. Perhaps he was referring to Ann, perhaps the molestation, but he started to become infatuated with autoerotic sexuality. He began peeping on girls. He would tell the doctor that if someone started killing when they were young, they would manifest a more abnormal thought pattern. While studied, it was noted that Ted was quick to anger and for no reason, and that he would physically change. We've all heard on our murder and mayhem shows how someone perpetrating the attack would change into someone completely different, and Ted fit that bill. Not only would his eyes darken and his body posture change, it was actually noted that his smell would change too.
Gag.
When it came to discussing his killings to those that were studying him, he hinted at starting at a very young age, perhaps even in his teen years. Ted was known to speak in third person, almost giving a sense of non-responsibility.
Ew. I'm sorry. That's so creepy.
Right? I mean,
Emily
in anyone.
Emily thinks
Third
that's
person
creepy.
third person is unacceptable
I only do it when I'm trying to be creepy.
on any level. Well, so I don't know if it's technically a third person, but he would say, well, that person. So he wasn't saying like, well, Ted thinks.
Oh.
So
I
it'd
see
be
what you
like
mean.
this disassociative style third person.
Like a O.J. Simpson type.
Yes. When talking about the genesis of his murderous inclinations, he said, the first victim of this other person could have been an 8 or 9-year-old girl. Sure, this isn't technically a confession, and in court it would have been easy to prove that, as a paperboy, Ted would have seen all the flyers with Ann's face on them. But it does show where his mind was, and being that he was 14 and Ann was 8.5, it fits. But there was a lot more than just a shoe print and a weird almost confession connecting Ted to Ann. There was the confession of having a habit of breaking into homes to look for cash, that he had a friendship with Ann, the fact that he matched the description of the young man that had been seen the morning of the disappearance stamping down on the dirt at the Puget Sound campus. And there was a pattern to what he dubbed his flaw, and his time in Tacoma fit that pattern. He would get depressed, so he would lie, steal, drink, smoke, and manipulate, and then kill. Then his mania would set in, leading to moving, changing schools, changing jobs, etc. He connected the mania to killing, and the release of the kill would actually lead to a depression. For some, the idea of Ted killing a little girl seems out of his modus operandi. He's known for all the college-aged girls with long dark hair being his victims, not 8-year-old blonde babies. But those were only some of his victims. Even when he was older, he had victims that were 14, and his final victim was just 12 years old. Through the years, he used an array of weapons and body disposal methods, so the idea of Ann being out of his MO just isn't the case. Being that we, Murder in the Rain, tell stories about the Pacific Northwest, we of course were going to touch on Ted Bundy. But what's more important here is the story of Ann and her family and the ripple effect these crimes have on the survivors. So if you want to know more about this Ted Bundy, just put his name into Netflix and you can learn all you want. When it comes to today's story about Ann, nearly all the information presented came from the excellent book Ted and Ann by best-selling author Rebecca Morris. We had the honor and true delight to sit with Rebecca a few weeks ago at Elliott Bay Book Company in Seattle to talk about her book, her theories, and why she and so many others are nearly certain that Ann Marie Burr was Ted Bundy's first victim.
And now here's a word from our sponsors.
Josh, I know you don't currently wear contacts and prefer your glasses, but I think it's time we change that. Personally, I choose to wear glasses most of the time because contacts are so expensive. It seems like every time I find a pair I like, they're way too spendy to wear on more than just special occasions. But thanks to Hubble, we can now get daily contacts at an affordable price.
Like most of the things we love, Hubble comes with the convenience of delivery right to your door. You can even start a monthly subscription. It's also very flexible. Hubble lets you easily change your subscription based on your needs, so you can change up your look without breaking the bank. There's no hassle whatsoever.
Not only can you get high-quality lenses delivered right to your door, it's so affordable. I just ordered my first 2 weeks, and all I had to do was answer a few questions about my current contacts, enter my doctor's information, and pay $1 shipping and handling. If I like it, I can easily move to a monthly membership. Talk about a no-brainer. And of course, I'll tell you guys all about it after my delivery arrives.
Wow, what a deal! It's too bad I have perfect vision and I'm missing out on such convenience and style. Josh, what are you waiting for?
Want daily contacts at a price you can afford? Visit HubbleContacts.com. You'll get 2 weeks of daily lenses shipped straight to your door for just $1. That's 30 contacts for $1 at HubbleContacts.com. And don't forget to select our show, Murder in the Rain, in the post-checkout survey.
That's HUBBLE contacts.com, the more affordable daily contact lens.
I can see!
Hey guys, my name is Miles, and I am so excited to tell you about my true crime podcast, Forensic Miles. My co-host and I investigate the cases covered in every episode of Forensic Files. You've seen the show, you know the crime, but is there more to the story? Let's find out. Check us out on Instagram at Forensic Miles, Miles with a Y, or listen on Spotify or Anchor. See you there.
Rebecca, thank you so much for joining us today. We're really excited to talk to you about this story and your history. So can you speak a little on your background just in Portland and television and radio?
Well, thanks for having me. I was one of the early women in broadcast television in Portland, meaning 1970 something, and also came to Seattle and then went back to Portland, worked in news radio in both cities and on the air and television in Portland, and then went east for graduate school in New England and stayed for a while. And then I was writing for the Oregonian for many years in the late 80s and early 90s. And actually, by then I was a theater critic and sort of filled in a lot on the Oregonian, but wrote pretty much everyday arts coverage for them. And that opened some doors for me in New York. And my husband had died really young, so I moved to New York. And as a
Why not?
freelance writer, but my fallback has always been radio and TV news.
Mm-hmm.
So I worked for NPR in New York. And I worked
Wow.
for CNN and
That's
worked
amazing.
for the New York Times radio station and taught some college, and then came back to Seattle in 2005 because I had family here. And I was writing for the Seattle Times and doing great big feature stories that sort of don't exist anymore in most newspapers, including the
Mhm.
Seattle Times. And I always liked to do stories that had something to do with, something that was in the news. And long before there was a television series called Snapped, I did an article about people that snap. In 2007, there were a number of missing people in the United States. There were some miners that were trapped in Utah. There was Fawcett, the private pilot, was missing. And I got to thinking about, I wonder how families cope when they never have an answer. And as I began to dig for some local stories to include in the article for the Seattle Times, I stumbled on this story about a Tacoma, Washington family, a girl that had been missing since 1961. She was 8 years old. And there'd been a myth or rumor that had sprung up decades later that maybe she was Ted Bundy's first victim because he'd lived in that neighborhood and he was a young teenager at the time. But Ann Rule, the great true crime author, always believed that she was Ted's first victim. And of course, she knew Ted
Right.
Bundy. And so I did a story for the Times, basically about Ann Marie Burr's mother, Beverly Burr in Tacoma, who was then 80 years old. I spent a year with her, and a year talking with her. It was the last year of her life. And she had wanted to be a journalist and had been married young and had 4 kids and then 5 kids. But she documented everything, and she saved every clipping that had ever been written about Ann's disappearance. It's still an open case in the Tacoma, Washington Police Department because they haven't found Ann. She disappeared on an August day in 1961. It was right before Labor Day weekend. And she was 8 years old. So I didn't set out to write yet another book about Ted Bundy because a lot of people have done that. But to write about Ann Marie Burr and her family and the toll it took. And then, yes, Ted Bundy is a figure in it, and his family. It's really about 2 families.
It really is.
The Bundys, and the Burrs. What I think is new about Ted Bundy in the book is that a lot of the books about him had kind of stopped in 1989 when he was executed in Florida. And as you probably know, he never stood trial for any of his murders in the Pacific Northwest. But I, because I was following the Burrs from 1961 to present day, then I followed Ted and his family to present day. What that meant was once he was on death row in Florida, he began to confess to some murders, or he never could really keep quiet. It's hard to tell when he was telling the truth and when he wasn't, but he had given interviews to some journalists. What I found that was very new is I talked to the woman who was his very last attorney, pro bono attorney, who was trying to get him a new sentence. Her point of contention was that when he'd been on trial for the murder of the 3 sorority girls in Florida, and remember, his very last victim was 12 years old. So he had killed other children.
Yes.
When he was on trial and acting as his own attorney.
Infamously so.
Please look up that footage on YouTube of him being his own attorney.
It's something to behold.
Oh, yeah. And
he made an escape studying to be an attorney from the second-story window of
Colorado.
Yes.
Yeah, he escaped twice, both from different Colorado jails. He actually worked against himself and his defense attorneys when he was on trial, and he wouldn't let them include anything about his childhood or his family background. So the point of the pro bono attorney and psychiatrist Dorothy Lewis, who was working as part of the team, was that he, in fact, had an extremely weird childhood.
That's an understatement.
And that should have been a factor in his sentencing. I got into more detail with that in interviewing people who'd never been interviewed, including one of his sisters, first cousin, that pro bono attorney, and the psychiatrist. And so you have to bring something new to a book about Ted Bundy.
Yeah.
Beverly Burr wrote Ted, and they exchanged letters.
Yeah.
They were pen pals for a while, which she was encouraging him to please tell her what had happened to Ann. And
just let me know.
Yeah. He, to the very end of his life, denied killing her. I actually have some good reasons to think that she probably was his first victim.
Yeah.
And he even would tell, the police or the FBI agent who became kind of a pal of his, and is that, your first crime is very special.
Yeah.
And you keep it close to yourself and you don't talk about it, especially if it's a child.
With your history of writing the Snapped article per se, were you always drawn to true crime even growing up, or did it kind of evolve that way?
Well, I was reading True Detective magazines, sneaking a look at them in the Safeway in Corvallis, Oregon when I was growing up. And I was, I love Perry Mason and I love some of the police shows, but I really did not know. And again, I went into this not thinking I was writing about a crime. I was going to write about a family and loss.
So you were approaching it more of a grieving aspect, and how do you move on?
And then I realized there'd never been a book about this case, and that I think it is the greatest mystery today in the Pacific Northwest.
Yeah. If we had had the television and the technology that we had even in the 90s, this would be the current JonBenet still.
Oh, it would.
It fits all of that same storyline. Young girl taken from her house. Is it ransom? Is it not? it would have the same energy behind it that JonBenet still
Yeah.
has.
And it was interesting how it was. I mean, I loved looking into how was it covered in 1961.
Mhm.
Well, there were 2 Tacoma newspapers. There were a couple of newspapers in Seattle, the newspapers and the Associated Press and UPI. It covered it extensively. At least one of the Seattle TV stations, those huge cameras and film reels, went to Tacoma. And there is on my website and also on YouTube, there's an interview that Beverly Burr gave the day her daughter went missing to a Seattle TV station that filmed it.
Okay, we will definitely have the link
Yeah.
to that on our
And
website.
you know what she's told me that I don't think she ever told anybody else in her entire life was she knew that morning she was never going to see her daughter again.
That really struck me in your book because it didn't come off as hopeless. It was almost more realistic.
She was being very pragmatic. And she sensed she was never going to see her. So I always think that's, and I think that's an issue that comes up for me in all my books is how do you hope and yet be perhaps a little realistic? So a woman, an expert I interviewed for the book and for the original Seattle Times article, writes about loss, and she said the healthiest families, the most successful families, actually kind of keep a foot in both worlds.
Well, you have to. You've got to hold on to that hope. I'm going to see that person again. But to be able to live your life every day and get out of bed and function, you have to, I would imagine, hold that of this is what it is. And we have to move forward with that being what's being presented to you is the reality. And that's what you have to be in.
It was a very curious case for them to investigate because there was no reporting of any strange car in the neighborhood. It was 5 o'clock in the morning. They lived just a block or two from the University of Puget Sound. There were a lot of buildings under construction. They called the police immediately, but also Ann's father and uncle went walking around the neighborhood looking, and they come back to the house and they tell the police, you've got to go up to the university and look at these construction sites. There are all these ditches, and there's all this excavation. The only time I cried writing this book, which took 4 years, is when I realized and put it together with some fuzzy sentence in the 600-page police report, microfilmed, that by the time the police went up there, the ditches were filled in. Everything was paved over.
Yeah.
And it was within 3 days.
Well, and that was the time and I believe it was Don, Ann's father, who looked over and saw a young teenage man, or in the wee hours of the morning she was found missing, standing in one of those ditches, tapping the dirt with his foot.
Yes.
And he fit the description of Ted Bundy.
On that same walk, you're right. He and Raleigh, his brother, saw a teenage boy standing at a ditch and kind of kicking the gravel in. Ted, many decades later, he liked to speak about his crimes hypothetically.
And in third person. Yeah.
But he hypothetically talked about going through the living room window, which there was a window opened in the Burr house, and taking a girl out into the orchard next door. They used to have an orchard next door. And then how he went back later and stood and watched the search. And I believe he talked about kicking the dirt into the ditch. And, I was advised to take a stand at the end of the book, where I think sometimes you have to say, if you don't know an answer. For sure. The fact that what I did in this book is I went back to his words. What did he say? And even if he was speaking hypothetically or in the third, he described this crime. And then I found somebody who'd grown up with them and knew both, who her brother was Ted's best friend, Cub Scouts and all of that. And she had witnessed Ted, peeing on little girls in the woods and killing animals.
And she was the one you mentioned in the book that reference kind of his metamorphosis when that switch would get flipped and that anger would come through and the eyes would change and the body would change and he had the odor, which I've, and all the things I've read and heard.
Yeah.
Your book was the only time I've ever heard this reference of almost this animalistic odor coming out of him when he was in that space.
Yes. And he also described it to the journalists he gave interviews to in the 80s that spent so much time with him. And they witnessed that his eyes would change.
With what you've read and seen of him, obviously narcissistic and a pathological liar.
Yeah.
But was there this secondary level of even more cruelty where he would lure or tease the idea of having done this, even though he didn't? Did that also seem like something, if I say it hypothetically or third person and they think I committed this, but I didn't, but I know all about the case. You know what I mean? That he's kind of teasing that it was him. Did that ever come across as something he might do? Or was he so narcissistic that he had to own everything he did in a way?
I think both might be true. I don't know that he ever fabricated crimes. Now, there is, this will be a mystery, I guess, for forever. He said he committed crimes in 10 states, and the police and FBI say it was 6. And, he infamously, when he was finally arrested in Florida and confessed to maybe 30 crimes, he told the cop to add a digit, meaning 300?
Right.
So a lot of people have taken that to mean that it was his victims were in the hundreds.
Mm-hmm.
And I imagine there are many that we don't know about. And again, he'd never confessed to murdering any children. If he said 10 states, if he said he committed murders in California, I think they just haven't figured it out yet. Now, his DNA is available for the first time.
Mm-hmm.
And it took decades. When he was arrested in Florida, there was a blood sample taken, and that was held up legally for decades, but it's now in the data bank. And so some cities, including Tacoma, have used it to try to close cases.
They have a lot of missing girls in Tacoma.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. And I think there's some municipalities and police forces in California that have also used it to try to close some cases to see if they can attribute a case to him. So what Tacoma police, they won't speak to me because it's still an open case, but what I read is that they've said it was inconclusive. But as far as I know, there was nothing left in the house. There was no DNA left behind in the house. There wasn't a tissue. There was, there
nothing to run. There was a footprint.
There was a footprint the size of a teenager's on this step stool outside. It had been pulled up to the living room window, and somebody had gone in. And I think that's why I think that Ann knew who it was, because she willingly, apparently, went out with him. Unlatched the front door and left, and her parents were asleep just on the same floor. And then she had her brothers and sisters both.
And this was a
upstairs and
night that it was
downstairs.
incredibly stormy,
It was
which I touched on
stormy.
earlier.
Yeah.
So
It was stormy.
the
and
dog's
they had a
barking because
dog.
there's a storm, and the house is rattling because there's a storm. So it's easy to dismiss all that. But
Yeah.
from the window that was always left open, and then the
latch on the
door
door.
open. Yeah.
Yeah. And I just, believe that she recognized whoever it was.
Because he was in the neighborhood. He was around.
He was in the neighborhood. He wasn't their paper boy. He was a paper boy. There was always the myth he was their paper boy. But then there was a teenage boy a couple of doors down who knew the kids. And
Is this Robert?
yes,
Yeah.
and sometimes played with the kids. And he had, in those days, police could, they went to school and just grabbed him out of school and took him and gave him a polygraph.
No
and
parents, no
parents,
lawyers, nothing.
So the first one was a little shaky, and he then had a second.
Although I will
polygraph.
say they had a right to talk to him because as a 15-year-old, granted, as you say in the book, he didn't have a lot of his guy friends his age in his neighborhood, but to go out of his way and have so many exceptionally younger
to have a
friends
relationship with really young kids
and call her your sweet
was
girl, that's
probably-
my girl, and
Yeah.
that's her lover boy. And
Yeah.
when writing the story, you befriended Beverly Burr, Ann's mother. When you approached her, was she open to talking about this and excited to have that opportunity? Did it take some persuading? How did you go about that?
Well, I phoned her and she picked up the phone, and it was one of the easiest things I've ever done. The initial interview for the Seattle Times piece was just done on the phone. When I knew that a Seattle Times photographer was going down to shoot her, I decided, well, I'd go too and meet her.
Yeah.
And it was only then that I realized, well, I've been wanting to write books. I couldn't have told you it was going to be true crime. It could have been any number of genres. Meeting her finally and then realizing there's never been a book about this case. So I went to Tacoma a couple times a week for a couple of years, and she was very open to it. She also had been really the face of this case because of her. Their every anniversary, she'd call the newspapers and remind them. And they were photographed a lot, she and her husband and kids. When they adopted a baby girl, it was a story. When anything happened, she would make sure it was in the news. When they moved, when she kept her phone number so that in case
anything happened.
I don't know. I don't remember if there were stories. There were a few imposters.
Yeah.
Who would come along,
Or the people like,
terrible.
oh, if you send me $200, I can fly to where she is and I'll get her and bring her back.
Yeah.
And one of the more heartbreaking, besides the case overall, heartbreaking moments was in your book when she was out gathering donations for the reward, and the guy she was talking to at the store didn't recognize her. And, I'm not giving money. We already know it was the parents. Again, back to the Jean Bonnet thing. And he's berating the parents, not realizing that's exactly who he's talking to.
Here's
And
the
she just
mother.
had to walk out the door knowing that that's what random strangers were thinking of her, that she would do that to her own child.
She was also very open with me about the toll it took on the family.
Oh, I can't imagine.
So her marriage to Don had not been great. And I believe she was thinking about separating. And if Ann, of course, she had 4 kids under the age of 8. If Ann had not gone missing, I think she might have kind of said she wanted a divorce or something. He was a very controlling guy and would humiliate Bev some. But then when Ann went missing, it just changed, of course, all their lives. They did, they adopted. There's been some little bit of fallout among one of Bev's daughters, Julie, who became the oldest at 7.
Right.
Was very helpful to me with the book. Some of the other kids, really didn't want to be involved, and that's fine. But there have been some hard feelings about how open their mother was about the marriage.
There was a sense in how you wrote her, almost empowerment from this. Of I lost control in a sense, and I'm taking it back, and I'm going to be loud, and I'm going to be in your face. We're going to be in the paper. We're going to hang 20,000 flyers. And so you did see this strength of her come through as time went on.
But the trust that you hopefully earn and keep with a family like this. I mean, it was incredible things that she shared with me, like when she was arrested once for shoplifting. And the counselor told her, you had something taken from you.
Yep.
And you wanted to take something.
Mm-hmm.
Here she is, this good Catholic, perfect Catholic wife and mother. She was just so incredibly open. And then there were days where we just watched Judge Judy because that was her favorite show. Or we'd sit out in the garden.
Yeah.
And every once in a while, I did kind of worry about this. Every once in a while, she'd say to me, she had all her marbles, but she'd say, now, what are you doing again? I thought, oh my God. But she...
I feel like she would appreciate having the sounding board. It's always filtered through the newspaper or rumors or this, that, or the other. And here's this person that's going to just listen to me, unbiased. Here's my life story, and here's everything that happened to us.
And she, eventually she'd wanted to be a reporter. So she, after, years later, she took some classes in writing and shared with me all the short stories she wrote. But, it was tough. There was one of her daughters is schizophrenic. And who knows what
Did
kind
you
of
notice
impact that,
either
yeah.
talking to her or her daughter the impact of the generational trauma that had been going
yes.
on?
There's no question. And I've seen that with other families that I've written
Mhm.
about, that that there's a passing down of trauma. It may show itself in alcohol. It may show itself in divorce, or it may show itself in other ways. Ted's first 5 years, we also know how important his childhood was.
Mhm.
He was illegitimate. His mother left him at the home for newlywed mothers, in New England, and then was convinced by her father to go back and get him. His first 5 years, they lived with her parents in Pennsylvania, and her grandfather was absolutely a sociopath.
Mhm.
Swung cats, the whole thing, had a stash of pornography, and was very much bullied. His siblings wished him dead.
Right.
And
Not a good man.
No. And then Ted's grandmother was institutionalized and had shock treatments and things like that. I was able to confirm the story that when Ted was 3, he put these sharp kitchen knives around his teenage aunt to scare her when she woke up. And she was scared.
Yeah.
So the psychiatrist, Dr. Lewis from Yale University, who worked with him when he was on death row, said that was, I forget the exact terminology, but the sickest thing she'd ever heard a toddler
Yeah.
do. So then at 5, when Ted's 5, he and his mother flee the East. Who knows because of what? Maybe the grandfather. And they come to Tacoma, Washington, where she has an uncle. And he lives a couple blocks from the Burrs, but they live for a while with Ted's great uncle. And according to Ted's teachers or friends, he was either, really affected by the fact he was illegitimate, or it didn't matter.
Mhm.
Sometimes he'd
What do
shrug it
you
off.
believe as far as what he believed with the whole background of my mom, or I thought my mom was my sister, but then I
Yes.
learned, do you think that was
That
really
was-
how it was
That
presented?
was one of the family's, stories
Mhm.
that he was told his grandparents were his parents, that he was a late in life child, and that his mother was his sister. Dr. Dorothy Otnow Lewis, who is very well known, and she's studied serial killers and written a really interesting book herself. And she says that Ted told her things she's never made public yet.
Oh, that's going to
been
be a
working
good
on that
memoir.
for several years. But she believes that all the serial killers she has researched and interviewed personally, and all of them, she knows all of them. She says they all have 3 things in common: that they'd had a head injury as a child. An autopsy did show Ted had a scar.
Mm.
But
Interesting.
No way of knowing
what
exactly
that history
happened.
is.
But a head injury, there was mental illness in the family, which
Mhm.
there was, and that they've been abused as a child, molested, and witnessed violence.
Mhm.
Ted met all
Yeah,
that
he had
criteria
checked every box.
in his childhood. And I think then finally, suddenly, it's been you and your mother for years, and now you've got 4 siblings
That
who-
aren't connected to you except the half sibling aspect, but that's a whole new life.
Yeah.
Where, I'm a newlywed, I've got all these babies,
Yeah.
and that he's from my old life. So whether or not she intended to neglect, I'm sure that perception for him was there.
Yeah. And she was a really interesting person, all this. She reportedly, to the very end, just before he was executed, she believed he was innocent,
Mhm.
or at least she said so. She attended, his trials.
I've
and
always felt that's kind of a survival mode of
It
I
probably is.
can't possibly fathom
I didn't
that
raise
this
a
person that
monster.
I created did
Mhm.
this.
Mhm.
Your brain can't process that.
One of the stories I tell in the book that I don't think anybody else has ever had is there's that famous photo of her, his mother, on the phone with him
Mhm.
the night he's about to be executed in
Mhm.
Florida, and she's in her Tacoma dining room on the phone. So the photographer was a Tacoma Tribune photographer,
Mhm.
and the reporter was an editor and reporter there, and so they're still around. And so I talked to both of them. They were the only people in the house that night.
She was just there
When
alone.
she was on the phone, her husband's sitting in the living room, but the only people there. And so they heard her take his phone call, and she's very subdued and contained and not sobbing or anything. And they chat, and she says, "You'll always be my son," or something. And then she hangs up. And then the phone rings again because he tried to call one of his sisters and she wouldn't accept the call. So then it's a bit anticlimactic
Oh, right.
that then
It's you again.
it's you again. And you have to say goodbye again. She didn't break down, at least as long as the photographer and reporter were there. But that's a very interesting
Yeah, that's some insight.
photo. One of the parallels I found between Louise Bundy, Ted's mother, and Beverly Burr is that somebody would come to talk to them, or somebody would come to interview them, or an imposter would show up, and then they would both say, "Would you like some apple pie?"
So they were both still very welcoming and inviting.
Yes, and it was always apple pie. And of course, this was 1960 something, but I just thought that is really interesting that that's the way both mothers handled that.
I know it took you about 4 years to write Ted and Ann. What did you find during those 4 years to be your biggest hurdles or time-consuming aspects?
Well, one of the big hurdles was that so many people were gone. Bev Burr was there and very, very helpful. But the two original detectives on the case who spent years on this, and even after they retired, they'd meet every week for coffee or lunch and to talk about the case and was there anything else they could look at. So they were deceased, and just a lot of other people in the story. That's a case where I had to pay hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of dollars for the police report. I wanted to, as usual, learn as much as I absolutely could. I looked at the city sewer plans for 1961 because, there was the chance he'd put her in his. They
did
actually,
a search.
Sure,
Mhm.
searched all the sewers and where they come out into the bay and everything to try to find out exactly what the construction plans were that week on the college campus. That took some time. So there was nobody left with the law enforcement end of it, although I did speak to wives and kids. So the memory, in fact, of the son of one of the two detectives was that every evening after work, that he and his father and his partner, they'd sit in the car outside in the driveway and talk about the case. So it was a big part of the childhood.
Yeah, so he had this insight, even though it wasn't on an official capacity, it was still there and part of his almost folklore of childhood.
Yeah. And then looking at other suspects and what would come up in the police report. One of the things I always thought was interesting was that a couple of years after Ann went missing, they were contacted by a prisoner at the Oklahoma State Prison who said that he had taken her and killed her. And they thought enough of his story that they flew him out and they took him and they went digging in this Oregon field where he said he'd been picking beans in the summer of 1961. And he and a friend had gone on a joyride, to Tacoma, Washington, and took this girl. Well, how did they know to go into that house? And he probably wanted to make some kind of deal about, his sentence and everything. But he actually had been in Oregon picking beans.
So part of it had enough truth.
Yeah, there was enough truth to it and everything. There was another really interesting case that there might be something to. About 2 years after Ann went missing, another Tacoma girl who looked quite a bit like her was missing for just a couple of days. She had gotten into a car with a man, and he'd taken her all over the Northwest and Idaho and places, cut her hair, bought her different clothing, and then brought her back to Tacoma and let her out after 3 days or so. So the media coverage was, is this another Ann Marie Burr case? But she, I don't know what was going on in her family life, but she had chosen to get in this car.
Oh, okay.
Now, can can a child really make that decision?
Right.
I don't know, but she apparently hadn't been. I don't know. Yeah, I don't remember. I don't know if she was molested or not. But then she was let off, and the first thing she asked for was some candy, and she went into a store when he let her off, and somebody recognized her. She didn't go crying and yelling.
Yeah.
you know.
Help. Give me mom and dad.
So they finally found out who he was. And he was literally a traveling salesman. And they tracked him to a motel in Portland. And when they were knocking on the door, he killed himself.
Oh.
Mm.
And as far as I know, they never found a real link to
To him being involved with
to
Anne. It
Anne.
was just a fluke thing.
But he did kill himself. And then there was a whole nother investigation. So there were 2 Don Burrs in Tacoma, Washington.
Yes.
There was our Don Burr,
Mm-hmm.
who was a civilian employee at a military camp there. And then there was the Don Burr, the architect, and very well known. And so they both thought that maybe whoever had taken her meant to take the daughter of the architect, because he would have money.
Mm-hmm.
And our Don Burr didn't have any money but there was never any ransom. There was never
Yeah,
anything.
it didn't fit. It made
was
sense as
never
far as
anything.
name and having a kid the same age, and the architect having that contentious relationship with the ex-wife and all of those
Yes.
things. But
Yeah.
it's not like they were in a custody battle, and it's not that there was a ransom request. So
Yeah.
kind of a weird coincidence.
You're right.
but-
I'd forgotten about the ex-wife.
yeah, in like
and the
Poland or
Chicago
something.
hotel
Yeah,
and-
yeah, that was.
So most stories like this, actually, they go on and on. There
I've-
are layers.
Yes, I found that
Layers.
with doing our stories where I just know the headlines and go, oh, yeah, I want to do that story. And as we get going, I get so excited and go, oh, man, this one's crazy because then the brother's DNA
Yeah.
actually did this and he was arrested for that.
Yeah.
And you just rabbit hole down. And next thing you know, you're
Making a podcast.
50
that's-
pages in.
That's why authors always think, okay, you can say you know everything about Ted
Mhm.
Bundy or the Susan Powell case or something, but you don't really.
Yeah.
You don't really till you read the book.
Mm-hmm.
You have to read the book.
So in going into writing this, you'd said there were so many Bundy books and everything Bundy, even still to this day. Did you believe that he was, or that she was his first victim when you were first going in, or was that more just a rumor that you wanted to see where it would lead?
It was a rumor. I had no idea, and I as I said, that wasn't what the book was about for me. It really wasn't a Ted Bundy book, but
Became one,
but it
because
became
that was
one.
the layer.
it became one. I didn't really know till the end when I was writing it, and when I talked to the people who'd interviewed him so much, and the attorney and the authors who'd tape recorded, and they gave me the rights to use their transcriptions in
Yeah.
the book.
Was there any moment in what you found in the evidence that really sealed it for you that this was Ted Bundy that did this?
I think, again, going back to his words as the best possible proof that I mean, if he had never hypothetically talked about the case or explained it, and then knowing that his last victim was 12 years old, and then he also killed a 14-year-old, so it
Wasn't out of the
it
realm
was
of
not out
possibility.
character. And at age 14, he he wasn't really on the radar when Ann Marie Burr went missing, but he was known to the police about that time for being a peeping Tom, and I believe he'd get into parked cars, and he started. He was the oddest guy. I mean, shoplifting was a big thing for him, even when he was in his 20s
Mm-hmm.
and early 30s. Shoplifting, a plant that would stick out of the top of his Volkswagen to be able to get it home, or snow skis, and a
Yeah.
TV.
Just
And
brazen.
Old items.
Yeah.
Really, not, and then socks. He would shoplift socks.
You always needed a clean pair.
Right.
Yes.
Well, now that guy's just a weirdo. now that I know that part, what a freak.
But this last couple of years, there's been so much attention
So
on
much.
Ted Bundy, with a Netflix documentary, a Netflix feature film, and I can't tell you how many. I did a 2020
Mhm.
this year about Ted, and there are all kinds of documentaries and things. And why him? You'll know this being from here. I think he's the anti Gary Ridgway.
Mm-hmm.
He's the seemingly charming, college educated, cute.
He wasn't kind of hidden in the shadows
Guy. He was
as
not in the
others were
shadows.
maybe
Lurking,
perceived.
creepy.
Yeah.
And he had a very different kind of victim. His victims, he was class was important to him.
Mm-hmm.
That's why there were so many college co-eds and the long hair parted in the middle. It was more about class than it was appearance. Gary Ridgway was picking up sex workers.
Yeah.
And, that wasn't who Ted's victims were. And I think it's, plus there's a whole new generation.
I was going to say, I think it's a generational thing when
right.
it happened, we were all babies or younger. And then as these stories go and everyone kind of talks about it, and now this whole new generation of getting into true
Learning
crime, and
about it.
he's,
Yeah.
kind of the top person. And
Yeah.
so I think there's a fascination, but that stuff, we obviously, being Pacific Northwest, aren't going to ignore his story,
Yeah.
but we don't want to regurgitate the same thing that has been told over and over, which is why we went with your story of Anne and recognizing her story and this possible connection to him, saying, hey, he might have started way earlier with a really little kid. It's also believed that Roberta Kathleen Parks, who was a student at OSU when you were attending,
Yes, when I was there.
that she was potentially a victim of his.
I think it was several years later by the time they knew that she was really one of his victims. And
So were you going to school the same time that she was? Or was
Yes.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay.
Yeah.
And
I
what
in
was
Oregon
that?
State.
Was there talk about that she's been missing? Was it anything known
She
at
was
all?
missing,
or-
and I don't remember that it was reported as, well, it wasn't reported as a murder or even an abduction. Like a lot of other cases, people will turn in their husbands and sons saying, my husband's been under the house doing something.
Mhm.
And
Or like that disgruntled employee that had called in, the janitor that called in his boss to say, oh, I know he has her.
yeah.
And they're like, no, you're just mad you got
Yeah.
fired. Stop.
And, with most crimes,
So many.
there's, looky-loos or
Mhm.
people, or maybe people that actually believe. But I remember I was struck in this case by how many women called in
Mhm.
about their
Turn in
husbands.
He just keeps
Get him out of
working in
my
the
life.
attic.
Yeah.
Why is he up
Yeah,
there?
why is he up there so much? So it's not funny, but it kind of is.
Right.
It kind of is.
Do you look back on anything that maybe struck a chord with you as far as something they may have fumbled with her case? Or do you think they did really everything they could for that time?
I think they did everything they could because, this was 1961, they had helicopters out there and volunteer searchers. Dawn is in the photograph of one of a group that's assembling to help the police. Every day for, I'd say, 3 or 4 years, they were searching. That's a long time.
That is a lot of work.
That was a long time. Having a missing person is a terribly devastating thing. And I really believe there is a sense of loss that's passed down into the various generations that follow. I think it's something that is always there. Maybe like with a plane crash.
Yeah.
If you've lost loved ones and it becomes part of the family story.
Mm-hmm.
But children, grandchildren, I think pick up on a sense of loss. I don't know how you do not have it make a difference.
Right. There's no way to not be affected by it.
There's no way to not be affected by it. I learned from Beverly Burr that you can learn to live
Mm-hmm.
with just about anything. I realized as an author, I think sometimes ambiguity is the ending of the story. I think it can be the answer or the ending of a story.
Yeah.
I think the story has an ending without really having proof of who crawled through that window. I think that is the ending.
Did Beverly feel that? Did she have her opinions on what she really felt happened after all those years?
Well, many days she would say that she didn't think it was Ted. But she'd also invested a lot of time in writing to him and hoping and realizing that other people and, even Ann Rule thought that it was Ted. She didn't know, and she really didn't choose an answer. She didn't choose a solution. Where I think other families, um, whether they have enough proof or not, they will decide on the story.
Yeah.
And maybe for that elusive, closure. But Beverly always said she didn't know.
Beverly Burr's strength had to continue through the rest of her life. She had to hold herself strong as to protect and support her children. They were scared to be home and fearful of being taken. But Beverly reached out to the man accused of taking her daughter, writing Ted in 1986 while he was in prison. She never got the answer she wanted from him, but you can read their interactions in Rebecca's book. It's fascinating to see the calm, but not desperate pleas from a mother, and to see the arrogant and dismissive response by a narcissistic megalomaniac. From a letter dated May 30th, 1986, Beverly wrote, "With all appeals likely to be refused, and soon there will be nothing left for you in this world, there can still be everything good for you in the next. Your life started going wrong somewhere when you were very young. There had to be a lot of bad things happen to make you have your strong feelings of hatred. I came close to ruining my life because of my cruel actions and feeling no sorrow about them. A lot of strange circumstances brought help to me I would not have found myself, even though I knew I needed help and my actions were getting out of control. You should have received that same help when you needed it. God can still give the help to you if you can gather any strength you have left and try to feel a real sorry inside for the horrors you have brought to so many. You will face these horrors alone if there is no chance to be with God after you die. You have nothing more to lose in this world. Will you write to me regarding Ann Marie?" So Ted actually responded, and these letters are all in the book, Ted and Ann. "Dear Beverly, thank you for your letter of May 30th. I can certainly understand you doing everything you can to find your daughter. Unfortunately, you have been misled by what can only be called rumors about me. The best thing I can do for you is to correct these rumors, these falsehoods. First and foremost, I do not know what happened to your daughter, Ann Marie. I had nothing to do with her disappearance. You said she disappeared August 31st, 1961. At the time, I was a normal 14-year-old boy. I did not wander the streets late at night. I did not steal cars. I had absolutely no desire to harm anyone. I was just an average kid. For your sake, you really must understand this." As time passed, the deeply embedded generational trauma started to ripple through the Burr family. Julie struggled the most with the loss of Anne. She became quiet and shut down. The children all helped as best they each could for their age in the search and the hanging of flyers. Don and Bev never got babysitters for their kids. Certainly that was to protect them, but undoubtedly only added to their fear and confusion. Julie was terrified as she approached 8 years old, the same age her sister had been, as though it was some sort of expiration date. 5-year-old Greg was too young to understand what was going on, but he was happy to have a house full of police officers, as any 5-year-old would be. Mary was moved into Anne's room and slept in her bed, but the bed remained Anne's, with her bedding and drawings hung on the wall. The family's identity became that of one that had lost a child. They were that family where the little girl was missing, no longer the Burrs. While some investigators were convinced Anne's disappearance was just a mix-up, going back to the Donald Byr that was the architect connection, there was never any proof besides a hunch and a coincidence. In the mid-90s, a psychiatrist contacted Bev, informing her he had a patient that claimed to have been Anne. The woman met the family multiple times and eventually took a DNA test. It was not a match. In 1999, the family held a memorial service for Anne. She had been gone 38 years. While the uncertainty of the Ted Bundy connection still loomed, there was some gratitude that while they didn't have Anne back, they also didn't know how she met her end. They didn't have to carry the idea of torture and murder with them, just that she was gone. Beverly shared with Rebecca that she was resentful that people assumed Ted Bundy abducted Anne. She felt it was just a fluke he was in the same city. Putting a name to the perpetrator didn't answer any questions or give her clues as to what happened to her daughter and where her final resting place was. Donald Byrd died in 2003 after 52 years married to Beverly, who passed away in 2008. Neither one died with knowledge of what happened to their little girl. On one hand, you look at this case and think there is no way a 14-year-old boy broke into a home and kidnapped and most likely murdered an 8-year-old girl and hid her body at a construction site. But this isn't just a clumsy robber we're talking about. This is intelligent, sociopathic, manipulative Ted Bundy. This could have been a crime of opportunity. Perhaps he had chosen a random house to dig around in for cash, reeling in the delight of adrenaline and excitement when his presence awoke Barney. Barney's bark woke Ann, and she came into the living room to find her pal Ted. Seizing the moment in Ann's hand, he maybe asked her to walk out the door with him. He was just seeing how much he could get away with, and out they went. Taking her to a spot in the nearby woods, he then carried her body in the darkness in the early morning hours to the Puget Sound campus, knowing construction was taking place, and disposed of her body. Yes, Ted Bundy is a fascinating character study of the worst places the human mind can go. But let us remember, behind that hunky facade is a real man that did real things to real people. This was only part of the story of how his potential actions affected a family and community. Now multiply that by at least 30 victims. Even if this wasn't Ted and there was a different perpetrator, we've all heard variations of the story through the years and put our blame on who we think might be a suspect. If you happened to have been in the Tacoma area in the 1960s and you have a tip, you can call Detective DeVault with the Tacoma Police Department at 253-798-4721. For way more detail and information than what you heard here today, please go check out the book Ted and Ann by author Rebecca Morris. You can visit her website, RebeccaTMorris.com. She's also on Amazon, Goodreads, Audible, Facebook. She's everywhere, and she is an even more amazing person than she is writer. So please go check out her work. One, your daughter's a kleptomaniac.
I did accuse her of that this morning.
Oh.
And two,
When she was sleeping, you
know.
woke her up.
Stop stealing my things!
I got him neutered, hoping, okay, he'll calm down a little. So far, all he does is hump faster and jump higher. Because he is kind of a shit.
I mean,
No,
kind
yep.
of.
We've met.
He's a real tuna two-back, if you ask me. I'm not I didn't make that up. I'm just saying that he is.
Passing on the tradition of cruelty.
First of all,
When was this?
Last
weekend.
weekend.
He was there with his family.
So?
I
So?
have a room
How
with
much time
Jocelyn.
do you
We're
need?
in different towns. I saw him for a few hours.
I've had sex with someone from a different town. Almost exclusively.
But I remember turning to her right before he got there, and I was like,
I'm gonna fuck him.
No, I said,
And I like the idea of a scientist, like going to school, being a scientist, and it's like, I'm a wheat engineer for the bagel of a bagel bite pizza. Anne and her 14-month-old sister, Julie. No, shit.
Jewelry.
Jewelry.
I'm trying to not do that as much so
That's
we can go on
probably
trips.
You and me.
The podcast.
I want you to take me on a vacation, Em.
I'll be your older sister.
All right.
You're younger.
You seem more like my older sister. If you were my sister, you'd be my older sister. I've
Your
thought
heart-
about this extensively.
Your heart is old.
You've thought about this extensively.
Gee, would I be a big sister too?
No.
You'd be
You'd
the
be Dennis
accident
the
that showed
Menace.
up.
Yeah, that's what I was saying. Yeah, you'd be like the kid sister. Be like, hey,
Don't forget about me, guys.
It was
Potato.
Shut your.
He did it to me. I had to pass the buck. I'll haunt you so bad.
Please. I would give you such a show. You'd be like, all right, I'm out of here. Bye.
Yeah, that's probably true. I'd be like, this makes me very uncomfortable.
I've made a mistake.
Oh, yeah, one of our like stoned nights in New York, and
Oh, yeah.
Josh was like, "What about when you die?"
Wouldn't it be cool if you died? If your soul screamed on the way to heaven?
Investigating. Okay, you're super into Goofy today. We get it.
He's hot.
He's just so tall, dark,
Something
and
about
handsome.
those teeth and that scarf and hat.
His teats.
6
Does
to
Goofy
8.
have 6
Goofy
nipples?
has between 6 and 8 nipples. I'm sure of it.
Yeah.
Probably has 7 because he's Goofy.
Suddenly we're nipple experts around here. I mean, I do have 3.
2, 3. Yeah. I know. 6.
How many nipples are in this room right now?
13. The detectives were investigating her hallucinations. The only evidence they found were her shoes and her grandmother jewelry. If you're 8.5, 14 months, so 7.5, so 6.5? No. And not fumble over any of the fragile figurines under the figurines. Fumble, fragile figurines. I have done this to myself. Eventually, a police... Hello? Okay. Well, my voice went away for a minute.
I need a moment.
Hello? Who is this? Who's calling? That was great. Am I in the air? That's great.
Of course, other not so helpful hints.
I love a good hemp.
When you were talking about the wives turning in their husbands, I like them. The idea of them like calling the cops and being like, "My husband is active several times a week. He goes up into the attic. He comes back 20 minutes later. He's very sweaty, very sweaty and relaxed." Yeah?
Sweaty and relaxed. Is that the album by Tizzy and Froth?
It is, yes. Sweaty and relaxed.
Hi, we're Tizzy and Froth. It's our new album, Sweaty and Relaxed.
Cool. It's a cool story. I love it. Yeah, it's very interesting. And especially because twist. That's Ted Bundy.
While in the midst of the investigation, the Truman Capote book, In Cold Blood, the telling of an entire family being murdered, would come to not Anne's mind, fucking asshole. There was a man named Alfred. Alfred?
The genesis of his murder
Ooh,
is
I like
something.
the genesis of his
murderous...
Tits.
When talking about the genesis of his murderous inclinations.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
Hot.
sexy.
Thank you.
My tits hurt.
The confessing? Damn.
So much confession.
Those are some of my favorite bloopers. When you say the wrong thing and then you repeat it. It's so funny. So funny to me. Confession. Charges.
The confession of having a habit of breaking into homes to look for cash is a weird way of how I said that. This is intelligent, sociopathic, manipulative. This is intelligent, sociopathic, manipulative. Fucking, are you kidding me? Or so they thought, now realizing he may have been barking to warn them of an intruder. Murder in the Rain is produced and edited by Josh McCullough. Written and hosted by Emily Rowney and Alisha Holland. Artwork by Jamie Costa. Music by Kai Pfeiffer at kyfifer.com. Check out our website, murderintherain.com, for additional information on all cases, a fun interactive map, and be sure to subscribe so you can receive our newsletter. Check out the Mad Props page for coupon codes from some of our sponsors. We love your reviews and seeing them on all streaming platforms, especially iTunes. And check us out on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. And suck my balls.
Please put that in.